Hello. Ooh, that is loud. Welcome to Recognizing Digital Dissemination, Scholarship in the 21st Century. My name is Emily Sherwood. I'm the director of the Digital Scholarship Lab at University of Rochester, just down the road, and I'm pleased to be moderating this panel today. I'm going to start off by introducing the speakers in the order in which they'll speak. They have between 15 and 20 minutes, we're still in negotiations about that, to talk. And then we will follow their short talks by what we hope will be a robust discussion with the audience. And so I will come up to moderate those. But it is my pleasure today to welcome Wendy Kozlowski. She is the data curation specialist at the John M. Olin Library at Cornell University. She is the Research Data Management Services Group Coordinator. Wendy's work focuses on scientific metadata and data description, data curation services for data sets in their IR or other repositories, outreach and consultation on information management, and other support related to research data lifecycle. She has a BA in biology from Boston University and an MS in ecology from San Diego State University. And she has spent 19 years in biology and oceanography research, working on multidisciplinary data sets with teams from numerous institutions both in and outside of the United States. Matthew K. Gold is Associate Professor of English and Digital Humanities at the Graduate Center CUNY, where he holds teaching appointments in the PhD program in English, the MA program in Liberal Studies, and the doctoral certificate programs in Interactive Technology and Pedagogy and American Studies. He serves as advisor to the Provost for Digital Initiatives, Director of CUNY Academic Commons, Co-Director of the CUNY Digital Humanities Initiative, Director of the GC Digital Scholarship Lab, and Director of GC Digital Fellows Program. He's very busy. He is series editor with Lauren F. Klein of Debates and Digital Humanities, and his collaborative digital humanities projects have been supported by grants from the NEH Office of Digital Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Education, the Sloan Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. And finally, Stephen Jacobs is a professor with the School of Interactive Games and Media at RIT. Professor Jacobs also holds the position of visiting scholar at the Strong National Museum of Play. In this capacity, he has served on the design team of their exhibits, including E-Game Revolution, the first permanent exhibit on the history of video games in the United States. Recently, he has acted as the producer for the original mobile games, an app with playable games on the history of pre-digital pocket games from the Strong's collection, currently available on iOS and Android. And he is an interdisciplinary scholar who works in game design, interactive narrative, and free and open source software and free culture. One of Professor Jacobs' recent projects includes LibreCorp, a faculty-led, student-driven open source consultancy for humanitarian free and open source software, projects, and communities. It has connected students skilled in FOSS community building and production with organizations and projects like UNICEF Innovation, Open APS, Night Scout, E-Enable, Sugar Labs, and others. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Hi. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this event. I'm really excited to be here and talk to you about something that really is truly near and dear to my heart. My introduction mentioned that I have 19 years of research experience, and so that's the perspective I bring when I come to the library and try to think with them about what it is that we want to do when we work with library as a content type. So I should stop talking and make sure I open this. Since you already know who I am. I tried to put together just a few slides to keep me on track. What I will hope to cover today is addressing the questions that are up there right now. What are we really talking about when we talk about publishing data? It's not necessarily a term that researchers tend to use when they think about sharing data. That's a word you might hear more often. And why is it good to do that? Why is it good to share or publish data? How can it be done? What are some of the methods? And what are some best practices that we can do as, from the researcher perspective, to make it a high quality, to add value from a library perspective to that content? So let's start with the idea of publishing. When I say publish or share data, basically that is releasing data for reuse by others. It doesn't give any kind of necessary connotation to whether it's been gone through any peer review process, any editorial process, even any curatorial process, but it is out there for others to use. So what you're going to hear very often in mandates and policies from publishers and funders is this requirement to share your data. And that's really what I'm talking about today, and I'll probably use the terms publish and share interchangeably. And actually, maybe I should also clarify what I say when I'm talking about data, because that can actually be misunderstood at times. So using the US government definition of data is research data is that it's any materials that support and underlie the underlying findings of your research. So it can be what we think of, and many think of very traditionally, numbers. If I don't have spreadsheets, I don't have data. But that's not true at all. If your conclusions in a social science study that you did include interviewing people, that interview tool and the set of abbreviations and how you did the actual qualitative analysis is all part of your data set as well. If you're looking at the historical extent of glaciers in Alaska over time, and your data sets are imagery that you actually do digital analysis on, those images are your data. So data can encompass many different types, not just what many people think of as numerical data. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why we're talking about sharing. There was a study done in 2013 on just over 500 papers that aged between 2 and 22 years old. And the researchers in this project tried to go through and find the data sets that were part of these publications. And you can see the pretty significant downward trend over time. The chances of those researchers actually getting their hands on the data, not even publicly, but actually being able to somehow get the data, fell by 17% every year over time. The main reasons they can't find data these days, or at least in this study, was attributed to a non-working email address. We always think our emails are persistent, but it's not as much as we think anymore. As well as corrupt storage media. Did you guys all know that external hard drives still have an average lifespan of only 5 years? How many of us keep our content on external hard drives? We need to be aware of these things and the impact that it has. So when you use some of the methods we're going to talk about for publishing or sharing data, it adds this level of security and access and availability to that data over time. And this number was actually really driven home to me when you also did that introduction, to think that the research I did at the beginning of my career is now 25 years old, which means there's only a 25% chance of me actually finding my own work. So. Also on kind of the fuzzy edge side of why it's good for us to share data is it really is good for science. We would like to have a return on the investment for the funding agencies, and we would like to be able to build on the research. There's a lot of people who think their work is only for the explicit purpose that they set out for it, but if we think about the work that we do, for example, in climate science, a lot of that information is repurposed from studies that were never intended to be looking at those questions in the first place. So we need to be able to think about the bigger picture and how our work might benefit others down the road. From a very practical sense, though, the reality of what I see in the library, why researchers are coming to me to publish or share their data, is this: because they're publishing papers. And the publishers, many of the large publishers, some of them which are up there, are requiring, as contingent on publishing the paper, you have to publish the data set that supports the conclusions that you made. So that has been a very strong driver as of late. Similarly, funder requirements. Many of you are probably familiar with the requirement that came out in 2011 for data management plans with the National Science Foundation. And since then, many of the major funders also require researchers to say, how are you going to keep this data secure while you're collecting it, but how also are you going to share it Or why might you not share it when your research is done? And that comes back to that idea of return on investment. So those are some of the major drivers that I see for why people are sharing. And I do actually get people that come to me and say, I just want to share because it's the right thing to do. We have that conversation. Sometimes it's like, well, we're out of money to support our own lab server anymore, and so the library is a good go-to place to solve those problems. But these are some of the really big drivers that I see these days for publishing data. All right, so how can that be done? What are some of the platforms people are using? So there are these things called data journals. Anybody out there heard of a data journal? Okay, we have a few people. So here's just a couple of examples. Some of these are what you might consider pure data journals. Scientific data is actually an output of the Nature Publishing Group, and it is a mechanism by which researchers can share data without actually making conclusions. So you set out on a project, and you collect all the information, you have a high-quality data set, but it doesn't actually support the hypothesis that you originally put out. And in many of today's publishing paradigms, you don't actually get to put that paper out there because you had a negative result. But these are mechanisms by which you can still share that data set and someone else may be able to reuse it. So the Faculty of 1,000 is another similar one. Faculty of 1,000 also kind of expands that idea of a data paper. You can just publish it and describe in detail your methods and what implications it might have, but you can also publish scientific results in Faculty of 1,000. And Earth System Science data, very similar to this idea where you can say this is a research data set that I think would be significant. It might be buried inside some internal report otherwise, and we're going to put it out there for the public to use. There are a few journals that still support, many journals that still support sharing data sets as supplementary information. So oftentimes this is in a storage facility that is supported by the publisher itself, or sometimes they ask you to prepare the files and they will share them in some other public repository. When I talk to researchers about good and bad and better, or bad, better, best ways to share research data, I kind of tend to discourage supplemental information unless it's with an open journal, because it still requires, in many cases, the person who wants access to it to actually have a subscription to that journal at the same time. So there are some limitations in some supplemental information files. But what I see most often, and what a lot of the major funders are really looking for, is that you put your content in a public, safe place that's going to be around for the long term. That's a capital L, capital T, long term. And I kind of group repositories into three main headers, and this is not official. This is just the way I tend to think about them. There are a lot of disciplinary-based repositories, things like NIH's Flybase. NASA has a huge repository. NOAA has repositories. There's some that are social science-based. You may have heard of ICPSR out of the University of Michigan. These all tend to take things based on content types. There is a distinct advantage to that in that they can do a little bit more with that data processing and offer services that would allow you to look between those data sets rather than at one at a time. So there's some really nice things you can do with disciplinary repositories. But there are also, ignore the pictures that just popped up. General was supposed to come up by itself. Well, I can merge that in there. So a general repository I think of is that it's not affiliated with a specific discipline or a location and takes data of all types. If you've heard of Data Dryad, it is a repository that up until very, very recently took only data sets that were associated with publications. They've opened that up now that they have association with the California Digital Library, but they take data sets of any type. And code is considered data as well, and it falls under that. So the same requirements by publishers and funders to share. And so there's repositories that people are already using, like GitHub, that aren't necessarily secure for the long-term access of the data. We have no idea, quite frankly, how long GitHub is going to be around. But GitHub ties in very closely with a repository called Zenodo, and you can essentially freeze a copy of your code and send it off for long-term preservation and access in Zenodo. And then the third category is what I would call institutional repositories, and Those are ones affiliated oftentimes with academic institutions. I know here at RIT you have an instance of Digital Commons. I couldn't find data sets in there. It looks like it's a lot of PDFs, but there are platforms that academic institutions are using that can hold data as a content type. And because I am intimately familiar with the one that we have at Cornell, I'm going to use it to explain some of the things that you might want to look for in a repository platform when trying to share or publish data. So of course the top three are really kind of at a high level, not necessarily, they're things you should look at across the board. So some of them are not institutional repositories, but repositories in general may have costs associated with them. You want to look at whether or not you have money to do that kind of sharing. Often they're cheap, $75, sometimes a couple $1,000s. It really depends on where you are in your career, whether that's going to impact you or not. And they have varying levels of preservation commitment. So a repository may say, I guarantee access to your content for 10 years, at which point the repository has the right to reevaluate whether we should hold on to that content and may deaccession it. And want to know what their access policies are. Is this content going to be available for everyone? Is it going to be locked down? Do people have to ask permission to use it? What are the repository policies around that? Then the ones that are at the bottom are really kind of value-added services that some repositories offer. So things like a URL that will work for the long run. Some of the brands of these that you may have heard of are Handle or DOI, and they're often used in the more traditional digital publishing industries as well. For data sets in particular, because that traditional paper is often the currency of tenure still, people like to have access to or direct links to related papers and publications, so a lot of repositories offer that. Licensing, again, making sure that the terms of access are really explicit on the getting to the content, and then whether or not you can get to usage analytics and whether or not there's some curation involved, and we'll get to that in just a second. So my last point is about kind of best practices for when you're sharing data, and you can take this from the researcher perspective as your own goal. I coming at it more as a librarian, as a service that we offer to researchers that submit content via our service. And how many of you have heard of this FAIR data idea? Couple hands again, all right. So I'm hoping that as time passes, you're gonna hear more and more about this. This is a goal that has come up within the data community about having these high-level standards of having our data that is out in the public be findable, and that means having good descriptors on it, having the metadata play into the major search engines and things like that. We want it to be accessible. We don't want it to be locked down. It's going to defeat the point. It might as well be sitting on someone's server under a desk if it's not accessible. Ideally, as much content, the data and the metadata itself will be interoperable, which means that it can be read on my machine or your machine and maybe merged with other data sets that are similarly described. And we would like it to be reusable, and this comes back to metadata again. A data set with no explanation around it is going to be pretty useless. So making sure people are properly describing this so that someone who isn't intimately familiar with the project from the get-go is going to understand that. And to that end, there are people out there who consider themselves data curators within academic institutions, as well as a lot of the disciplinary repositories. And this is a neat little pseudonym, no, not pseudonym, that's a fake name. What is it? An acronym for some steps that we've started to think of as a process for looking at research data. And it fits neatly into the idea of curate. So when we get a data set coming in that people want to share at Cornell University, we take a really close look at the files themselves and the metadata. Is everything that the researcher says they're going to share, is it actually there? Can I open the files? Does it take special software to open them? are the file names things that make sense, or are they data1.xls, data2.xls, and things like that? So we look very closely at them. That blurs into this idea of understanding them. So someone sends me code, I strip down my installation of MATLAB or R, and I start from scratch, and I see if I can actually run the code. I don't test for reproducibility. I don't check if their results match the paper that's related to it, but I check if I can actually run things. Did they give me enough instructions in the file so that I can get those files out and make them usable? And if those things fail, I go back to that author and I say, here are some things that would make your data set stronger and more fair. Hopefully, they'll provide us that information, and we go ahead and we augment either the files themselves or ask the researcher to change those files, or we do it from our end, especially when it comes to the metadata. Oftentimes, sharing data, especially when related to a publication, is a last-minute effort, and so they rush through the idea of creating their descriptive metadata. And so we work with them to do a good job with that. Depending on the format of the file that has been provided to us, we actually do some transformations on them. In an institutional repository, in our institutional repository, most often that's changing them to a non-proprietary, non-Microsoft format. And sometimes we still share the Microsoft files along with the CSV files, but we do transformations. And then we go back for our own purposes and try to evaluate, have we made this data set more fair? That is my last slide, so I will leave to the next speakers just with the thought that there really is, like the other content types that you're going to hear about today, I think a lot of new things that are still coming to light that we're discovering as we try to publish data as a content type. And there's a lot of resources that we're still trying to define, whether they're in terms of the infrastructure or the long-term costs of storing large volumes of content, or if it's around making sure that we have the right skill sets to do this editing and curating of the research data to make it useful for the long term. That's all I have. Thank you.
Let me just start by saying thank you to our hosts here at RIT and RIT Libraries. Thank you to Emily for moderating this panel, and thank you to my fellow panelists. My presentation today is about a specific scholarly platform, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how, with this work, we've tried to enable new, different kinds of scholarly publishing. Although thinking, I think, about some of the same questions that were articulated in the last presentation, particularly about what is it that we are actually publishing, and are there ways to publish not just, say, the article itself, but also the data associated with it. And I would say one of the central things we've been thinking about with Manifold is how can we present them together as an interactive experience? How can the data and the associated resources, be they images or film, videos, or interactive elements, how can they all be presented together with the scholarly argument itself? So Manifold Scholarship is a project, a collaboration between a number of institutions. My institution, the CUNY Graduate Center, located in New York City, the GC Digital Scholarship Lab, the University of Minnesota Press, and Cast Iron Coding have created Manifold through the support of 2 grants from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And I want to take a second and just thank our team, which has been integral to the creation of this thing, and just also to note that what I think has made this project notable, or one of the things that's made it notable, is that it's a collaboration of 3 very different types of organizations: a university press, a digital humanities lab, and a development agency run by someone who has a PhD in English and has an academic program. So it's really, we've found in our collaboration that those 3 perspectives have come through and helped us create a platform for publishing that reflects the values of each of those entities. One thing I just want to note is that as a platform, especially when focusing on digital publication, we still love books, and we love print books. And it's important to say, because when you are creating a digital publication platform, people often oppose that to print publication, when in fact our entire rationale from the beginning has been about helping university presses and other publishers publish both print and digital. So the idea is like hybrid publication, and allowing the workflows that lead to print publication to also lead pretty easily to digital publication. The project has its origins in Debates in the Digital Humanities, which is a book published that I edited and that was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2012. A year after the print publication, we released an open access interactive website that contained the text and allowed for all sorts of annotation and commenting. And when the Mellon Foundation came to the university press community and asked it to think about the future of the monograph and how, especially the future of the digital monograph, the press and my shop and Cast Iron Coding, which had created this interactive version, wanted to take what we had done here and make it into a platform that others could use. So our goals and or what we were thinking about when we were starting to create Manifold involved pushing digital publishing beyond the static PDF. Often people talk about the importance of open access, but then what they're actually sharing is something that has the virtue of being stable in PDF form, but isn't really interactive and doesn't in some ways take advantage of lots of the affordances of the web. We also wanted to connect text to ancillary resources, so a lot of the data that we just heard about. We wanted to showcase scholarship as a project. So in other words, one of the ideas we were working with is iterative publication, how a text moves from draft to final form, and could we create a platform that showcased that? We also wanted to meet a need for scalable editorial and production procedures from presses, and to move DH publishing beyond PHP-based frameworks. When this project started about 5 years ago, there were still a lot of presses were using PHP-based platforms, and we felt the need to sort of move into a little bit more modern frameworks. So among our objectives were creating beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, well-designed, responsive publications that looked as good on phones and tablets as they did on the web, incorporating rich archives. Importantly, building this platform in conversation with existing university press workflows. So one of the first things we did was to say, where do presses wind up before they send the file to the printers? And and where we wound up was that most publishers are, not all, but most publishers are winding up with an EPUB file, which is a zip format that they send off to the publisher. So that's one of the things where we started Manifold, is to say the way to get text into it is you ingest them in, and the starting format we started with was EPUB, although we've gone beyond that. We wanted to connect publications to social networks and also make a publishing platform that felt like it was of and for the web. So we focused on design. We focused on creating a tool that had a viewpoint. It presented a certain manner of publishing, and we focused on all the other things you can see here: user experience, accessibility has been a very large focus of ours, and on community. So we've had a transparent editorial and production process throughout. It is also important to say that Manifold as a platform it's grant funded, it's not for profit, it's 100% open source. So all of the code that powers Manifold is on GitHub and is freely available. So I'm just going to show you a couple of quick aspects of Manifold, and just to kind of show you what it is and give you an orientation to it. What you see here is what you might imagine a publisher that publishes lots of text. This is its series of texts. And we call projects the sort of the basic building block of Manifold. So this is a particular project called Building Open Infrastructure at CUNY, and a project can have multiple texts. When you go in and start reading Manifold, you can see that you can highlight text, you can annotate it. Whatever you highlight sort of shows up in the annotation. You could say, you know, this is a great argument, and save that and publish it there, and others can then sort of, you know, go back and see and reply. You can also highlight text and do other things like share it with citation information, et cetera. So it's basically, it's a platform that allows for different kinds of interactive publications, and importantly, also that allows for the use of media with those publications. So this, for instance, is a book called Metagaming that the University of Minnesota Press has published. And if you look at it, what these authors have done in this book is to publish the text. Oh, I forgot to mention that you could also really adjust sort of how the text looks and whether it's serif or sans serif, et cetera. But you can see that they've got ancillary resources like images, or they also have videos that can be played from right inside the book. So this is a way of kind of like bringing the text together with other resources, which can also be grouped together and shared. So here are a bunch of different resource collections that are associated with the text. And if you're a researcher, you can imagine that this is one way of publishing not just your argument, but also the various data that you gathered. Maybe a little bit less in sort of like the sense of publishing it into a repository, and more into thinking about that moment of publication and seeing the argument and dialogue with the data. So that's basically, it's a really quick version of Manifold. And then I just want to highlight a couple of use cases to show how we've been seeing people use Manifold. The first instance is the University of Minnesota Press's instance of Manifold, and they and others are using Manifold to publish publish their texts. So for instance, this is the University of Arizona Press, and they've got something called Open Arizona, which is currently down, so I shouldn't. They are publishing all of their books online through Manifold, and this is the University of Minnesota Press's repository of texts. One of the things that they're doing is they are doing something called iterative publication. So if you look at what they're doing with their instance, they have books here that are not yet published in print. They may be under contract. This is a book called The Lab Book with authors who are doing surveys of various media labs around the country. So although their text hasn't been published, they're generating conversation around it, and the platform sort of captures that social media conversation through the Twitter hashtag. But they've also been publishing their source materials, like their interviews and conversations with lab directors. So this allows the book to kind of generate conversation before it even becomes published. And there are multiple examples of that Minnesota is doing. There are scholars who are publishing not just their own materials that they generate, but also the source texts that are inspiring them, so that they are kind of annotating source documents through Manifold that then become part of the book publication. And then there are also people using Manifold for peer review. And moving forward, we have groups experimenting with Manifold for journal publishing and also for single project publishing, where instead of publishing a whole lot of books, they're publishing just one project. So the way Manifold works is that it's not a space where you actually write the text. Instead, you write your texts in Microsoft Word or Google Docs or Word Docs, and then you kind of ingest them into Manifold. And you can upload all sorts of resources as well. You could also include interactive resources, and this is where, although this is still developing, it's what I think is one of the most exciting uses of Manifold, where you can publish a text and then you can also start publishing interactive data. Like this is an RStudio Shiny app that as you can actually explore the data and sort of dig into it while you're say reading a text. So something like that I think is very exciting in that we allow people not just to even publish a static view of the data, but an interactive view of one. We've got another one here, I think somewhere here we've got a Gephi diagram. This is another interactive bit of data. But you see it like this. This is making the space of publication itself a space of data exploration, which is something that we're really kind of focusing on. We also have, I'm just going to mention, I'm not going to go too far into it, but I do want to highlight teaching and pedagogy, in part because it's important to me as a scholar, but also because I think we sometimes forget that our moments of teaching and pedagogy can become points of publication. And among the ways we've been seeing people use Manifold is to kind of create shared course text that can be annotated by students. Those of us working in the CUNY system and SUNY systems and really all over the place, we're working a lot on open educational resources so that students can save money on textbook costs. So especially if you're working with kind of public domain text, ingesting, if you can find them, high quality EPUBs into the platform and having students annotate them together can be something that's really great. We also are seeing Manifold being used as an endpoint for student writing. So we have examples of classes that, as they've gone on, their final assignment is to collectively produce a text of some kind, and then that text gets published in Manifold. So I'm not going to, because of time limitations, I'm not going to go too much into the back end, but I would just say that there's a full kind of back end to Manifold where you can administer it, add metadata, and to say that, again, on GitHub, the larger project is shared, including our roadmap, which will show you kind of what we're doing, where we are, and what's up next. I would also put in a plug for our blog where Jojo Carlin, who's a graduate student at the CUNY Graduate Center, is publishing Travels with Terrence, which tracks our digital scholarly projects editor, Terrence Meyer, as he travels across the world, actually, to help people get started with Manifold. In case you're interested in the technology stack, I just wanted to show you that this is what we're using. And we have full documentation. And what we've seen, especially over the last 2 years through the support of a Mellon Grant, is more widespread adoption. So we've got a whole bunch of publishers, which sometimes are DH centers or individual scholars using Manifold. And then we've just recently announced our second round. And there are lots of exciting use cases here. And I would highlight Gallaudet University Press, which is doing a lot of work to publish sign language and deaf and hearing impaired publishing. So thinking about how something like videos can be used to share sign language and stuff like that, and sort of like thinking in new ways about the publication space itself. So we have various services associated with it. I'd invite you to look at the website and find out more about it. But I guess I just want to close by saying that we've been thinking about how to reshape the actual space of publication and think in ways that puts the digital publication in line with and in connection with print publication while simultaneously taking advantage of new forms of interaction that the web makes possible. There are tons of challenges to doing this kind of work, and I think some of the ones we've been thinking about, I think relate to your presentation, thinking about preservation and issues of sustainability, which we're thinking through very seriously, and maybe can talk about in the Q&A. But our goal really has been to create a platform that that's easy to use and that helps people publish academic texts in interactive ways. Thank you.
Hi. So we had kind of big picture data. We had platforms. This is going to be project-centered, primarily RIT projects or related projects. Very quickly, I spent a lot of my life in what is often referred to as informal education settings, zoos, museums, things like that. And so my kind of engagement with digital humanities is either kind of informal education or kind of a journalistic approach, information for the general public rather than for academia per se. And so these projects kind of all follow that line. So, and the engagement in this practice started right when I came to RIT as a tenure track professor. And this was a time in which this idea of the graphical World Wide Web was about 18 months old when we started. And I had a colleague, Gordon Goodman, and he and I for many years worked with the local arts and cultural institutions in town to get them up on the web. That was kind of my first engagement in digital humanities. We started with the George Eastman House, and both because the newness of the idea of websites and because they were between directors, we couldn't get the project officially approved as the official website of the Eastman House because it went up between directors. So it was released as a student project about the Eastman House until the new director had enough time in seat to actually approve what we did. So this is kind of the early emergence of this kind of stuff. And we formed an organization called CAROL, which stood for Culture and Arts of Rochester Online, and working with the Arts Council in town. We put up about 30 organizations over a period of about 7-8 years. Since then, my work has pinged back and forth between officially sanctioned university projects and kind of personal projects that engage with students in the university to do this kind of work. My colleague Elizabeth Lawley over there and I and a team of other folks worked with the local newspaper to create a game called Picture the Impossible, which is the newspaper-styled window on the left. I guess it's your left, yes. And so a lot of what we did here was to get our own local community engaged in our history and our local institutions. There's a tendency that if you live there, you never do those things. I grew up in DC, born in DC, and the number of DC natives who've never gone to the Washington Monument or don't know any of its history is huge, right? If you live there, you don't know about it. So this was successful in getting roughly 2,000 plus people playing every week and learning about the history of Rochester. So we found that to be very satisfying and successful, and we'll talk about impact a little farther on. The next one over was the Finger Lakes Interactive Project, Flip for History, and this was the tourism department and New York State. New York State at one point divided $1 million between various regions, including Western New York, which is our region, to kind of improve tourism. And so Flip for History took you through different local sites. It was kind of a scavenger hunt app. You went to a local or regional cultural institution, got some augmented reality interaction with whatever the content was within that entity, and then had a website where you could I visited 10 of these and you get these many points, that kind of semi-gamification to make it move forward. It was an educational process for New York State tourism to understand how this stuff works. They had picked, for example, Letchworth Park as one of the places they wanted to highlight. And we had to tell them we couldn't do that because there's no cell phone coverage in Letchworth Park, and so we could not build or at least then, there's probably better interactivity now, but these types of things are learning not just for the students and for the faculty, but often the institutions that are engaged with them. So things you learn. Most recently, I've done a couple of personal projects and a couple of university partnership projects, and each of them brings kind of different technologies and different relationships into the mix. And I hope to talk about those briefly without going over time, and we'll see how that works. This one is the Jewish Play Project website. Roughly 6 years ago at this point, I stumbled across what's called an open secret. Or who does not know what an open secret is? Okay, we have hands, good. So an open secret means that within a certain group, everybody knows a piece of its history. The external world does not, often actively pursued by the internal group, right? So you're probably more familiar with comic books, and probably 15, 20 years ago, the fact that a lot of the primary creators of comic books or the publishers thereof were of Jewish extraction and brought pieces of their culture into those comic books. People in the industry knew about it for many, many years. The outside world did not know about it until books started coming out to talk about it. So accidentally, 6 years ago, due to a side project with a Jewish children's museum, we were going to build an exhibit on play and games in Jewish secular and religious life. And I said, oh, well, you know, just like there are 10 well-known Jewish baseball players like Sandy Koufax, right, there are maybe like 8 or 10 toy and game designers and companies. So we're going to build this small hall of fame. And I started to do my research. And when I came across 135 people and 85 companies over 200 years and still had not come near reaching the end, I said, oh, well, this is probably a thing that somebody should talk about. And I reached out to various contacts in both the toy and the game industry, and especially the Jewish scholarship history studies community, and discovered that nobody had actually figured this out except the toy industry, many of whom did not want me to highlight this work. Those concerns were, of course, related to the potential for anti-Semitic abuse, so on and so forth. And those concerns were validated by the fact that because this website has the word Jewish in its URL, the administrators here on campus tell me that it receives 5 times the number of malicious security probes of any other website hosted on campus, with people trying to take it down or subvert the content or et cetera, et cetera. So this is created in something called Timeline.js, which was originally a Knight-funded project, Knight Foundation project. It's a piece of code that lets you, either using a database or just using a well-formatted Google spreadsheet, put data in and it spits this out. Now, we subverted it a little bit. You'll notice here, if this is my interactive one, where's my arrow? Oh, there it is. Okay, thank you. You may have to do that multiple times. It's always a challenge, right? So generally, Timeline.js works on one timeline. We subverted this to do 3. But this whole interface is created by that piece of open source code. All we did was fill out a spreadsheet. And what this gives us is the ability to kind of click around, said he, trying to click around. And it has stopped displaying. Am I in PowerPoint? I may have to bounce toward the other window. Please excuse me one moment where I find my arrow again. Help. All right, well, I'll just talk about it since I can't click on anything here. The website gives us, now it goes to the next slide. Thank you. All right, so we get interoperability between the links, so that if I click on a company name, it will hop to that timeline and that entry about the company. We've built in a lot of external links there, as you see on the sources, that we can go through back and forth. This is entirely what's referred to often as a born digital site. All of the content here, except for the textual descriptions in the upper right side of your screen, upper left side of your screen, Everything else is generated from other websites that we've linked to or pulled their data in. So there was no precedent for this before we created this website. The next website here is a more personal project. This is my great-grandfather's diary. The boy sitting on the lap of my great-grandfather is my grandfather. They didn't dress boys like we dress boys now when they're infants in those days. So that was not a girl in a dress. That is my grandfather. And this is the personal diary of his time period in the Russian army. He was a Polish bookbinder who was roughly 20 years old, who was conscripted by the Tsar's army to serve a term. We were lucky enough that he was conscripted just after the time period in which there was a differential between Jewish soldiers and other soldiers. Before this time period, Russian soldiers were conscripted for 3 years and 8 months, and Jewish soldiers were conscripted for 25 years. Luckily, he had reached the point where it was equal across the board, and it was still 3 years and 8 months. And 2 years into his enlistment, he became part of the Russian invasion of Manchuria. Historically, there was this thing called the Boxer Rebellion. Ever heard about that? Where the first multinational army ever created went to go and invade the imperial seat of China because they had locked down the diplomatic quarter in any kind of China for the Chinese type of revolution that was supported by the emperor. But Russia saw this great opportunity to try to annex Manchuria as a whole rather than just support that. So he spent 10.5 months following this journey that you see mapped over here. Well, wait a minute, that brought something up. Where's my arrow? Where's my arrow? So what we have, the book here is the actual Yiddish script of his diary that he wrote, and it's probably a memoir rather than a diary, but he called it a diary. The text you see is the translation into English. Throughout this timeline, we also have data from, on the Russian side, we have the Russian census that says how many Jews were in a certain town versus how many non-Jews were in a certain town. That data is there. And if you were able to click on these pins over in the map, you would jump to the diary entry for where he was in that time. In kind of an understanding of what war was like in those days, it took them 4.5 months to get from the starting point to Manchuria, primarily by rail and then by boat to where the Boxers had dynamited the railroad tracks and you could no longer go by rail. They spent 2.5 months in China itself defending the Chinese peasants who lived in the town from the Chinese bandits who were raiding the town. So what benefit there was to the Russian oligarchy, who knows? And then they spent another 4.5 months getting back to the Ukraine. And so all of that is documented. There's very little information on the life of Jewish soldiers in this time period. There are both the historical, kind of what it's like to be in the army on those days, and some of the Jewish cultural information from his entries on, you know, what it's like to be marching to war during Yom Kippur, in which you're supposed to be repenting for your sins and spending all day in synagogue, and those types of things are also part of that. Oh, and just briefly as well, what this is the joy of open source is you can take technology and morph it. So this website is done in something called Time Mapper, where somebody took Timeline.js. The timeline stuff is all Timeline.js, but they built in GIS capability. So now you can have a map and a timeline interact. Another piece of information about how this was built is this: all of the images for the diary are in Google Docs, And so Google Docs automatically lets us scale that image or jump to a new window with the full image. So if you can read Yiddish script, you can see what the actual words were for free, right? We did no technological work. It's just part of that. This you see right in front of you is a project with NTID funded by USAID and World Vision. It's to increase the literacy of deaf children around the world in the written language of their sign language. So you take storybooks like this, and you'll notice you see English and HCMSL, that's Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh Sign Language. So you can select both in the text and, if you've loaded it in the sign language, multiple languages. So this content is meant to be crowdsourced. The platform is all open. And the idea is not only will communities of deaf people and deaf educators build stuff for their particular communities, but ideally, people from other places will hop on and add their sign languages and their written text to make those stories accessible to communities elsewhere around the world. Does that make sense? Okay. It also has games, kind of like workbook style games. So these are the type of traditional bus you find in Manila, because we first tested this in the Philippines, called jeepneys, and you select videos and words in the windows of the buses to go ahead and do the kind of workbook, match the text term to the sign. Most recently, with the Strong National Museum of Play, and you'll notice this is on the Switch, we created an app that allows you to play a bunch of these old handheld ball and maze games. This is an act of digital conservation and conservancy, as well as dissemination for a museum. These things are made out of tin and cardboard and glass, and you can't have the 500,000 people a year who come to the Strong actually use the objects, but you can distribute the objects as a game on phones or tablets, or now this is the first educational university game on the Nintendo Switch, and so you can actually reach a different audience. So you get the digital version that's playable, you get the actual photograph of the object in the collection and the history of that game. And because it's a game, you get things like streamers. For those of you who don't know, streamers are people who play games on Twitch or on YouTube and talk about what they're playing. So last week, the Game Grumps went ahead and featured this, and we have had almost 560,000 views of them playing this game. We have comments here about, well, 80% of the comments were picking on one of the guys who thought all of the games were for the 1800s, even though one had a World War II airplane in it. But if you extract the abusive comments out, you get stuff about, I had no idea that the Strong Museum has made these games, that kind of outreach. Academically, this stuff is still not considered to have the same weight as journal publications or even conference publications. So things we have to do, and things we do is go to these conferences to not only disseminate the work, but also to get the Institute's recognition this is viable. We also get things in books, news games, from MIT Press published stuff on Picture the Impossible, and CRC Press just published Doing Things with Games, Social Impact Through Play, where there's a case study of building the original mobile games. Thank you for your patience of my failing technology, and I think it's question time.
So before we start the Q&A part of our panel today, what I would like us to do is to have a short conversation with your neighbor about what was talked about today, about questions you might have, about takeaways that you've observed. And there are a couple reasons why I like to do this at the start of a Q&A session. One, some of us take a little bit longer to process what we've heard and to come up with that really good question, right? So it helps us kind of talk through our ideas. That'd be me. Two, sometimes we have a really good comment that actually isn't a question, but it's a really good comment. And so maybe run that by the person sitting next to you to see if you can get it phrased into a question for the panel before we ask it. So sometimes you can just run your ideas by someone first too, which is useful. And then some of us too, we don't like to raise our hands and stand up and ask a question, but we still are really excited about the ideas that are raised in a panel like this. So we want a moment to be able to talk through those ideas and really be able to participate and converse with each other in the room. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and we will, please, I'm serious, if you're not talking to somebody, I'm going to come around and partner you with someone. So we will reconvene in 5 minutes and talk through your ideas and see if you have a question that maybe you're going to want to pose to the panel and the larger crowd in 5 minutes from now. Thank you. And Nick and Francis are on both sides of the room, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and please use the mic so that we all can hear you. Questions? Yeah. Oh, and please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Liz Lawley. I'm a professor here in interactive games and media and worked with Steve to make Picture the Impossible, which we've asked the NEH to fund a new version of, so we're excited. But here's the thing, when you propose to redo a project that you did 10 years ago, especially something like an alternate reality game, which isn't a thing, it's not a single object, it's not a data set, it's very hard to go back and reconstruct all of that, which has got us thinking a lot about preservation of digital humanities projects that are neither data sets nor texts, right? So Manifold doesn't work for us because it's a very text-centric thing. And in fact, almost every digital repository that we have access to starts with the who's the author. Okay? When you've got a big, complex project with multiple people having worked on it, you don't have one author. You have a code base, and you have data, and you have videos, and you have websites, which of course are no longer online, right? The screenshot he put up, the Picture the Impossible, had my login, because I'm the only person who ever took a screenshot of the site. Which is a very long statement to a question, which is, do you know of tools or projects right now that are well suited to that kind of complex multi-object repository storage? We're starting to think a lot about that here in terms of games and DH projects.
Are the mics on? Yes, they are. So unfortunately, I will say this with a caveat that preservation is not my background. However, one of the things we were just discussing up here is the awareness within the library community, certainly, of needing to address those concerns. We had a project at Cornell that looked at that very thing about access to multimedia content from 20 or 30 years ago, and how critical all those pieces that you discussed, as well as kind of the infrastructure underlying them and being able to recreate those. I can't tell you a particular package that is going to be a solution, but my recommendation would be very strongly to work with the library on those pieces of recognizing what has to be preserved. I think it's going to be a multidisciplinary solution even to it. So what to preserve and then how to preserve it might be two different sets of expertise that need to address that. Unfortunately, I don't know a particular package that's a one-size-fits-all for that.
I wasn't so much asking about particular software, but more implementations or work towards this that you know people are currently doing, so that we don't end up reinventing the wheel.
I mean, I would say one project I don't you may or may not know about is called Web Recorder. It's from Rhizome, from the new museum, and you know their concept there is to preserve interfaces by like sort of recording a kind of web-based interaction experience that then becomes saved and can be re-navigated by people who explore the recording. There's also some work around using Docker as a preservation strategy. So the idea with, like, especially if you've got a series of a technological stack that depends upon or if your project depends upon a certain technological stack that will need to be recreated, thinking about using something like Docker to create computing environments where it can then be kind of replayed. And just generally this idea that the kind of virtualized experience can somehow record something. But you know, I would say, and one of the things we were talking about up here was, you know, the preservation discussions we've had in Manifold, and I think it gets to be very difficult, and I think to some extent kind of existential when you start asking these questions about what is it that we should preserve, what what is possible to preserve and why should we preserve it, and for what reason. And I know for Manifold, among our preservation strategies right now, we built this whole project to get away from PDFs, and yet part of our preservation strategy right now involves exporting PDFs from Manifold to Portico so that they can be saved. And I find that very frustrating because, first of all, it does away with all of the work we've done on the interface, which is what I feel like has been part of what the project is about. But I think there's also a balance to be found in sort of what we preserve. And I tend to feel that it is okay for projects to, there are people who have this term graceful degradation, that, it's okay to let projects sort of like go, and we have to come to grips with the fact that we can't preserve it all. But I do think from what I've seen, these two strategies of, one, trying to kind of record the experience, while the project is going on, and then two, trying to preserve in some way the technological stack through virtualization. Those are the two promising strategies I've seen.
The challenge is a lot of our scholars in games and media and digital humanities, their scholarship doesn't take the form of a paper. Mm-hmm. Right? So if you want to cite that, if you want to show it to a promotion and tenure committee, telling them, sorry, it's gracefully degraded, is not going to be a viable strategy, right? And so these are the things we're trying to wrap our heads around. In some ways, it's reassuring that I haven't missed some obvious thing that you're like, well, why didn't you look at that?
Right.
So thank you.
But I do think Docker is, something to explore. And just to note that there is I think it's Carnegie Mellon or the University of Pittsburgh has a grant from the Mellon Foundation to explore Docker as a preservation strategy. So that's the only thing I would say to look into, but I know they're also at a very preliminary stage.
Cool.
I was also going to jump in and say that Greenhouse Studios at UConn is doing a lot of work around how you recognize the various forms of labor and collaboration that go into digital scholarship projects. So when you were talking about having 100 authors and they're doing all these different things, you might look at the work that Greenhouse Studios at UConn is doing.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, for example, on the project Liz and I did together, I was the game designer. So how do you tell your bosses that you were the? Luckily, we have a document internally that explains to our tenure committees what the heck we do, so that they get it. But yeah, I mean that's really interesting.
Another question.
Hi, I'm Sarah Thompson. I'm an art historian here in the College of Art and Design. I have a question about copyright. And because I'm an art historian, I'm often working with images that are made by other people. They're often held in repositories, museums, libraries. And those museums and libraries, even those who've started to make more of their images available for open access, have been increasingly reluctant to grant usage for things with an unlimited web access. And it can be really difficult to get someone to actually, sign a permission release that says that you can use this in an unlimited way for digital publishing. And I don't even know what they would say about, can I put this on an open access website forever and ever? Any thoughts about, I don't know, how to encourage these kinds of places to be more open to the possible use of work outside? Or how do you solve this issue then?
So what, two instances of what we found, if I can remember them both. The first one, a lot of it is about ask forgiveness later. So one answer is that in the game preservation world, the Internet Archive started preserving games, and they, a museum is very careful about these kinds of things and permissions and all that stuff. The Internet Archive just went ahead and put up every game that Atari had ever put in web browser emulation as a test. And what they got back from Atari was not, here come the lawyers, but we see what you're trying to do here. Here are the 50 we care about that still make us money. You're going to have to take those down, but you can leave the rest up, which is a nice way to handle things. The other enabling approach, I've been trying to publish a book, or write and then publish a book based on the Jewish Play Project. And in doing this, I went to various academic presses, and I noticed one academic press opened an option for an open access published version of the book. And this is, like many academic presses, this one required a subvention, i.e. a payment up front to help with publication costs. If you wanted to do a closed, solid book publication of your work, there was a $4,000 or $5,000 subvention. If you wanted to publish it as open access, the subvention was either $12,000 or $14,000, right? So people are grappling with this. Some people are dealing with it better than others.
I would just note so Mellon has been funding a bunch of projects around digital publication, and one of the ones they funded in the last 5 years or so is Yale University Press with thinking about art history catalog publication, and they have, what they did is they created I believe a platform for publishing catalogs, and the way they dealt with a copyright issue is to make an argument about fair use, and to say that the way it works is that they show images at a kind of low resolution, and in order to see them at a higher resolution, you have to click into the image, and they argue that that act of clicking in represents a scholarly desire to sort of explore the work. However, I think the concern is, like, is this possible if you're any other institution that doesn't have lawyers willing to go to court to argue the fair use case? And so I don't know how widely applicable it is, and I also don't know that it gets to the roots of your larger question, which is how do you get the cultural institutions and art institutions themselves to really change their habits? I do think it has been kind of amazing to see these museums start publishing their collections online. So that open data movement has been at least very positive in that direction.
Yeah, it's been an interesting thing to watch. I mean, the Met, for example, has made high-resolution images accessible. They're very clear about when you can use them. But even a lot of these places that are doing that kind of project still have limitations in their fine print as to how many copies of a book can be published before they consider it a for-profit enterprise, and then they will no longer allow it to be used in open access. And when you're saying, I'm going to put this on the web, then they don't know how to define how many copies of something that would be, and hence they back off.
Yeah.
In some of the places where, like, the Folger or the New York Public Library have made their digital collections freely available, one of the benefits of something like Manifold is that you could embed from their website, so that you're helping, the same thing with Omeka, right? If you're pulling exactly from the resource and their holdings that they're making available, then you're actually embedding and linking directly. So you're helping, that helps circumvent some of the issues.
Yeah, and in the Jewish Play Project website, we link out to everything, right? So the downside of that is, of course, when these things go away, you basically kind of have to put upon yourself going through the whole thing every given time period to see what's disappeared, and can you find the same thing somewhere else, or do you have to just go without?
Joe? Okay. Nope. Microphone, please.
Hello. Hi. I'm Joe Easterly from the University of Rochester. I have a question about the Jewish Play Project.
Sure.
And I was just wondering about the relationship with the Strong Museum of Play and any other community-engaged aspects of it, maybe with the local Jewish Federation, or if there's been any educational programming that's happened or on the horizon.
So, since I'm dual positioned over at the Strong, they were very helpful in verifying my facts. They're able to go out to other people in the industry and say, is this guy crazy, or is his list right? And what we got back was, his list is right, and I wish he wouldn't talk about it. The Strong stance, which I understand, is that they will supply the material cultural to any institution that wants to do an exhibition, but they don't feel it's appropriate for them as a non-Jewish institution to do the interpretation, to be the lead, which I understand. I may not agree with, but I understand, right? I haven't done much locally yet, primarily because I've been trying to navigate the do I set up a museum exhibition elsewhere, which I have not been successful at, or do I go and write the book. So I'm going to go write the book. I am in talks with the Federation about maybe doing something down the road, but again, ideally you want to use the material culture, and museums at a certain level have an institutional mandate that their stuff can only be released to other institutions that have the ability to do essentially archival presentation, right? So if I'm going to do something like an exhibit at the Federation or at the JCC, I essentially have to do it with photographs or other things because they don't have the security or the exhibition stuff in place that the Strong requires for their stuff to be shipped to. Am I being coherent? Yeah, exactly.
Other questions?
How would you suggest motivating or pushing traditional academic curriculums to accept more digital and interactive modes of scholarship? Oh, I'm a PhD student at the University of Rochester. My name's Marcy. For instance, we have the Digital Scholarship Lab, and I'm super happy that we get to use that in my digital history class, but is there any hope for classes on like secular criticism to make those more digital and to make that kind of very scholarshipy, erudite information more accessible to the public?
I will take a first shot at this. And I think, what you're talking about is in some ways like a kind of larger cultural shift and acceptance of digital scholarship, if I understand what you're asking, sort of like how can we get this kind of work to be accepted and more widely spread? And, I do a lot of this work at my own institution where I'm doing a lot of institution building of trying to make people aware of what's possible using digital platforms. And so, we've had a number of strategies. One is to be very student-centered. So, for instance, we do some support of faculty, but most of our support at the graduate level is for graduate students. And what we try to do is to show them what's possible with digital scholarship. And where the light bulbs go off in the faculty members' heads is where they see a graduate student engaging a digital platform and it actually impacting the scholarly argument that they make. And I think, I've been on a number of dissertation committees where I've seen that happen. One that comes to mind is a scholar, Heather Zuber, who was working on socioeconomic mobility in 18th century novels. And she had an argument that was her dissertation in an English department, but she realized she wanted to map it, and she had no mapping skills, she had very few digital skills, but she began to plot out the journeys that characters in these 18th century novels took, and once she saw them spatially, her argument changed, and then that became part of the dissertation she submitted, and it brought the faculty along too, because they could see how it wasn't until the tool impacted the argument that it sort of, the things clicked. And I think, the one thing that, say, as digital humanists or people who are excited about technology have to, I think, always think about is to help students and others bring it back to the argument and sort of think about the research questions and how the technology affects or can interact with the research question, because that's what I think faculty and the academic world at large really responds to.
So there are multiple layers in all of this stuff. It's not an easy question. At one level, it's generational in terms of faculty and university administration, that no, really, this stuff is scholarship. No, really, this stuff is work. Part of it is financial, right? Our institutions need to make money to keep doing what they do. So we've experimented with MOOCs, massively online open courses at RIT. We did one on game history with the Strong Museum, was the first one that we did here on campus. And there's no real return on investment in terms of bringing the cash that it would have cost. Yes, it's soft cost. I'm on salary. The folks in the media department here at RIT who help produce it are on salary. But it's a lot of people's time and a lot of people's effort that the university needs to justify having been spent on it. The games on the Switch, and they were released on iOS and Google Play first. You know, they're given away for free. We put in a boatload of human chargeable time to make that happen that we will not get back. So you can get academic institutions or other entities to do that once in a while on the argument that the visibility and the marketing and the advertising and the we did it first value is there, but to get them to put everything out digitally for free or even for cost, because at a cost level that would bring the ROI to us, people won't access it, right? It's really difficult depending on what level you're looking at. And this is not a problem RIT faces alone. This is the institution and the industry, right?
Also, Marcy, I would just say that even Wendy's talk about thinking about the data sets, like the data behind, that those things are also out there in the world and being published. So the more visible, I think one of the things that each of you have highlighted in a really great way today is you've highlighted all of the other aspects of the labor that go into play and have this dialogue with what we think of as traditional scholarship. But in doing that and making those things visible and seeing them in conversation with each other, we are more apt to start to recognize them also as scholarship because they are part of our scholarly labor. And so putting them out there in the world makes them visible and makes it, therefore, countable in some ways. So you can have then the metrics on how many times your data set was accessed or used in other contexts, and how many times those other contexts or research projects received grants, and how many times then those things are brought back, those items are brought back together and analyzed in a text that was published on Manifold. And I would say that as our faculty start to see that more and more and see those interconnections and have that labor made visible, they may be more apt to also bring that into the classroom. But I would also say that another place you can go is to your professional organizations. So the MLA has put out recommendations for tenure and promotion for digital projects. I know that there are other faculty who are working with their professional organizations to do that as well. And as those conversations continue to happen, you will see a shift, even if it's a very slow one, I think.
And
Wendy?
there are hidden costs that you don't even think about. So for the Mordecai Marches to Manchuria site, the diary site, my family paid for a translation of that diary, which was written in multiple different dialects. So even to find someone to do it was really challenging. But I had to get another level of translation done on the document because it was important to me that as much as possible, the page from the diary and the translation and the entries and the map all lined up. That translation wasn't done, if I'm trying to show everything that happened on one date, that was translation by the page. It wasn't, broken down for me as to this is what happens on this page. So if I'm going to do a reasonable representation, I had to go back through it, break it down by date, and then find another translator to say, so where does this date start and end on the pages of the diary because I can't read it, right? So you wouldn't think about that when you're looking to move something to digital, and yet those kinds of things pop up.
Wendy, do you have a last minute?
I think you've covered it good.
Oh, sorry. We're good? I want to thank the organizers for, it's 3 o'clock, right? I'm not, okay. I would like to thank the organizers for having us here today. And I would also like to thank our panel. Will you please join me in doing so?